Hi, everyone. I recently did a podcast episode outlining my living mirror theory of consciousness, and I thought I would do a kind of more condensed, to the point version of the theory here. So there's a long version if you want to kind of get into the full picture, but if maybe you've seen that already, you want to just kind of think about the kind of core of it, then this is what I'm hoping to do here. So you have the hard problem of consciousness. How is it that you have minds in a world that's made of matter? What kind of story can we tell to account for the existence of consciousness? So we're kind of interested in the kind of why consciousness exists, where it exists, what kind of systems, and how it exists, how it could be possible for it to exist. So we have to really think about what kind of solution we're unconsciously anticipating when we think about the hard problem of consciousness, because that's part of the reason it seems hard, is because sometimes we implicitly have this kind of this feeling that we take our concepts like matter and mind or consciousness, and we take the concepts, the kind of, the concept matter, which we think of as this kind of solid, hard stuff. We take that concept and we forget that it's a concept, and we forget that the actual reality is this strange, deeply mysterious stuff that we never get to know directly, and that we can never actually make statements about the intrinsic essence of it. We actually don't know what matter is in its essence, and the human mind just it's not capable of understanding things in their own right. So our kind of all of science, all of philosophy kind of talks about the kind of the behavior of systems. Science in particular, we're talking about the way that systems behave. And the description of the physical world in science is not a description of a substance. It doesn't make claims about matter being a certain thing, but it describes the way it operates. And it should be even more obvious with consciousness that we can say the word consciousness, but the kind of easiest thing to do is to then say, well, I'm just going to assume it's a different substance. I'm going to assume I know what matter is as a substance, and I'm going to assume I know what mind is as a substance. And this is just a kind of naive form of dualism, where you think there is two stuff, there are these two kinds of things, and you suspect you know what they are, but if you really kind of drill down, none of us can actually say what the essence of consciousness is, or of matter. And this isn't to say consciousness doesn't exist. It exists as a phenomenon, but it's not made of a substance. This is why it's such a weird thing to try to describe, because it's not something we can really get our hands on as a kind of substance. So that's important to keep in mind, that it's not that we know what matter is and we know what mind is and we're trying to map directly from one to the other. We have a deeply mysterious natural world which encompasses stuff that we call matter, that can be measured, and stuff that we call mind, which is kind of private and can't be kind of objectively measured. And our description should be stories about the world that describe their behavior. A good theory of consciousness should describe the structure of our consciousness. It should describe why, we perceive things like food to be kind of appealing or unappealing, and our conscious perception of it being kind of flavorful or disgusting. It should account for our color perception, all in terms of evolution. And if you can do that in a kind of quantitative way, because you can map out the structure of consciousness, you can say that that there are three kind of dimensions of color perception. We can say make these kinds of claims and map it onto the physiology. So there is a way to you can come up with scientific theories of consciousness that can be tested empirically by looking at the structure of experience and how it relates to the structure of the physical world. So I think that some people think about the hard problem as a kind of metaphysical problem. They think they know what matter is, they know what mind is, and there's no way to go between the two. I'm saying we don't even need metaphysics. We just need to say, here we are in the world, in this strange natural world, and we can describe its behavior. And there are these two different things. There's the objective space that we can share between us and we can measure, and then there's this subjective space, but it's all just stuff happening in the natural world. And if we can describe the behavior and the kind of the why of consciousness, the how and the what, what systems have it, why do they have it, where does it exist, that's the kind of explanation I think we want as to the place of consciousness in the natural world. So what kind of story can we tell? Well, the story that I'm telling is that to be alive requires you to attempt to know the character of the world around you. And if you have a system that believes things about the world, say it believes the simplest thing, it believes in existence as opposed to non-existence, then you have a conscious system. If a mug is incapable of believing things, believing in qualities like redness or other colors or smells, believing they exist out there in the world, whereas a living system is capable of holding beliefs like that, then the living system is conscious. So this is what we're talking about, is another way of thinking about consciousness. If we want to be precise and not assume we're all talking about exactly the same thing when we use the word consciousness, if we are kind of safer and we just say, okay, the problem here is how is it possible for a system to have beliefs in qualities like existence or color. All these things are things that systems like ourselves hold to be true. That's what I mean by a belief. So I'm saying that all living systems, in order to survive, and this is linked to the second law of thermodynamics, because the universe is falling apart, you can't just survive without doing this effectively, without anticipating what's going on in the world around you. You can't survive. And this can be kind of unpacked at different levels. You can talk about it. I'm starting out here at the kind of conceptual level where I hopefully give you some intuition as to the basic idea, but then it can be taken all the way down into kind of statistical physics and mathematics, and the same thing can be seen at that language, because we're talking about the same story. So I think one thing that people might feel with this is, okay, you have life, you have living systems, they're surviving. Why can't all that just be mechanical? Why can't all that just happen with no consciousness? The rest of nature, non-living things, they do just fine being kind of eroded away by mechanical forces acting on them. Everything's kind of described by this, by the physics of just things physically kind of pushing into other things. This is classical physics. This is what happens at our scale for non-living things. Well, the thing is with living systems is we kind of self-create ourselves. We're these kind of circular structures. There's a process that kind of brings the process into existence. And so we're the puppet and the puppeteer. A single cell is not created by an intelligence outside of itself like we might do for an AI. It creates itself from the inside. So where is the kind of starting point? Where's the anchor that allows that process of creation to happen? Well, the anchor here, as opposed to being kind of an outside intelligence, the process itself is what's important for the existence of the organism, because it is the organism. But the thing that kind of allows the whole thing to happen is that the system is coupled to the world around it. From the inside, it holds that the world is a certain way. It kind of conjures up a system of beliefs about the world having a certain character, and that allows it to be coupled to the world around it in a way that allows it to avoid kind of destructive forces and move towards things it wants to move towards. So life is fundamentally different in its physics to non-living things. Now, there's no kind of undiscovered laws of physics that need to be introduced here, but there are emergent dynamics that are being explored in statistical physics that are what make life different to non-living things. And the more we look at that stuff, I think that's the right framework to look and say, if you look at the physical operation at the informational level, there's something very interesting going on with living things. The simplest living system you can imagine, a single bacteria, it's like a vast universe. It's a whole world of stuff going on there, and it actively engages with the world. And so the reason it can't just be mechanical and it needs to be conscious, again, conscious in the sense of having beliefs in the character of the world around the system, is because the things that are important outside the system, relevant for its survival, something like the correlation between wavelengths of light that get reflected from a surface and its kinetic energy, which give us the conscious experience of color and heat. Those things are related. And if you have kind of photosensitive receptors like in our retina, it's highly beneficial for your survival to be aware of a correlation there. That if something is reflecting long wavelengths of light, which we perceive as red, it might be hot. That's a very simple kind of feature of the world that the system needs to hold to be true. And that correlation, this is what I call a statistical feature in the world, or statistical structure. But what I mean there is a pattern. It's a pattern that exists in the interrelationship between the kinetic energy and the reflectance properties. There are no particles that can bang into the system to make it to directly deliver the message of here's the correlation, right? Like that's just not what's going on. But what is going on, because that the outside world can't impinge on the inside of the system in that way, the picture is one where the insides of the system are doing this fundamentally creative act. At the level of information, they're generating kind of models of the way the world is, and it's coming from within the system. And the physical arrangement of the kind of the molecules in the system is instantiating at the level of information. Think of this like the kind of transistors in a computer being the hardware, but the kind of software that gets run on top of the switching on and off of the transistors is at the level of information. So you've got the physical stuff of the system, but at a level of information, it's instantiating that there is this correlation out there in the world. And again, it's not detecting it directly. The correlation isn't acting on the system, but the system is inventing these things. And the ones that have the same structure, those are the ones that get kind of selected for. So I can, if as a living system, I come up with this, I imagine there's a correlation. I need to be careful with my language. If I say imagine, I'm kind of presupposing consciousness. But if my physical evolution holds that, by holds I mean the physical arrangement is kind of instantiating a certain way that the world is. So if the operation of the system holds that there's a relationship between short wavelengths of light and heat, so we would intuitively think of this as hot things are blue, that's incorrect, and I'll die, and I won't get selected for. So the kind of evolutionary process and the process of life makes sure that there's the kind of fitness of the world, the things that are patterns in the world that are relevant to our survival, come to our internal kind of, again, to use more flowery language, you can think of like a simulation of the world outside. They come to be, to kind of mirror each other in their structure. And so now this is why the system has to be conscious. It can't, because I'm saying holding beliefs about the world being a certain way, having a certain character, when the world actually doesn't have an appearance, it doesn't have a kind of objective character. Food isn't actually objectively disgusting, but the pattern in reality for you of eating food that's deadly to you, there's a real pattern there. And so you condense that pattern into this belief that food is what we would say disgusting, but disgustingness is just one dimension, or like one kind of perturbation of this framework of beliefs and qualities. And so because it's coming from within the system, this is why it's consciousness. I'm arguing it's the same thing. That holding a framework of beliefs and qualities about the world, like living systems do in this picture, is to be conscious. So that explains what systems are conscious, living systems, all living systems. It explains why they're conscious, because, actually, maybe that's to get into the why. I've done it partly there, but another kind of, actually that kind of explains the how you get from matter to this kind of framework of beliefs and qualities. But then the why, you might want to bring in thermodynamics here. So this whole picture is coupled to the evolution of the universe. Because of the second law of thermodynamics, everything moves towards disorder, but living systems kind of resist this tendency. And so if you're going to have a boundary with the world that keeps you existing over time, it just turns out that if you look at that, the kind of statistical physics of that, the way that that happens is for the insides of the system to infer things about the world beyond. And this can be cast in terms of mathematics, as I said, in terms of statistical physics, of the kind of entropy minimization in the boundary, which happens to be equivalent to Bayesian inference of the insides of the system inferring properties of the world around it. And the fact that that's true at the level of mathematics should be a strong indicator that the stuff talking at a conceptual level, it relates to something real that's going on in the world. So that's the kind of why. Why should consciousness emerge in this world? And where does it emerge? In living systems, because they need this internal kind of picture of the world to anchor themselves as they create themselves. They can't just be knocked around by things like, a rock being worn away in the ocean, because that's not what it is to be a living system. And so you would look at a living system, if you could see all of its operation and understand it, you'd be able to look at it from the outside, look at the informational, if you could kind of get access to all the states and understand what's going on, you would look at it and say, oh yeah, that system believes things about the world. It has a framework of beliefs. And the reason I'm using the word framework here is this relates to what I said at the beginning about the fact that consciousness isn't a substance. It's a phenomenon that exists, but you can think of it as like running, right? Running isn't a substance. Running emerges out of systems like ourselves that can do certain actions, and it produces this thing called running, but it's emergent. It's not reducible. You can't reduce running to having limbs, right? That's not the same thing. It's an emergent feature of the world. And so consciousness is a real phenomenon, but it's a peculiar phenomenon, much like running. It's something that if you were to say, how does matter give rise to the substance of running? What you first have to say is running isn't a substance. Let's describe its behavior and what it is and how it comes out of the world. And so consciousness, rather than being this kind of substance where, it's made of different atomic experiences, this is kind of Western idea of qualia, that red is some kind of experience that stands on its own terms. If you look in systems of thought, like in Buddhism, there's this concept of emptiness, that if you really pay attention to any experience like red, you'll find there's nothing there. There's no intrinsic essence there. Red is only red in a kind of relativistic way, in that it's not blue and it's related to warmth. And all of these kind of experiences, all of these beliefs about the way the world can be, give rise to each other. They arise together. They're like language. It feels to us like if I say the word banana, that maps onto the physical object of a banana, because that's how we use it. But if you look at language, it's entirely self-referential. Banana only means banana because it doesn't mean other words. The meaning is kind of, it's like a house of cards where everything's leaning on everything else, like a kind of M.C. Escher painting where it just kind of loops around. And consciousness is like this. There's no intrinsic essence to any particular experience, but seemingly out of nothing, we get this flux of being able to say or hold that the world is one way as opposed to another way, all within this kind of internal framework. So it doesn't have to be borne out in terms of anchoring it to kind of properties of the external world. We don't have to say redness needs to be a property of molecules, but redness is a property of this belief space that we have as living systems. So that's my story that I genuinely find satisfying as to the question of how consciousness relates to the physical world, where it comes into existence. It's not a story of kind of X properties of matter give rise to X properties of consciousness, where I assume I really know what both are. It's more a picture of the whole natural world, where you say we can talk about the patterns we observe and where they exist and why they exist, and we have to look at the whole picture. Actually, I didn't say this in my previous thing as to why it's called the living mirror theory. Maybe it's obvious. But the idea is that you've got living systems of these kind of three-dimensional structures, and the living part is because it's all living systems. And it's kind of mirroring the structure of the world around it. And in the way I described earlier, in this kind of fundamentally creative way. So that's where the mirror analogy breaks down. But much like explaining a reflection, if you looked at the surface of a mirror and you wanted to say, what is it about the mirror that gives rise to the reflection? if you're going to restrict yourself to just looking at the surface of the mirror and not considering the photons out there in the room that get reflected off of objects in a certain pattern, then you're not going to understand what a reflection is. A reflection arises through the interaction of this flat surface with the already patterned photons that are coming off of other surfaces and being reflected in a certain geometric arrangement. That's what gives rise to a reflection. So you can't look at a brain and say, I know what consciousness is, as if it can exist separate from the physical world, and I know what matter is, and I'm going to map from one to the two. That wasn't going to work as an approach. But what you can say is, in this whole picture of the world, there's living systems that kind of cast these internal reflections of the character of the external world, but again, in a fundamentally creative way from the inside. But you need to be looking at the whole world. So the existence of consciousness is not a feature of separate organisms. It's a feature of the environment coupled with the organism. You can't have consciousness without the two. If you go into the vacuum of space, then you won't be conscious for long. And that might sound trivial, but it actually points to this thing that because the life process is what's crucial for consciousness, it's all about this being embedded in reality and responding to the world beyond. And it should have kind of seemed obvious to us all along that it's something to do with life, right? When you die, you're not conscious anymore. It seems, very kind of clearly coupled to being alive. There's also kind of a similarity with the word spirit being to do with the kind of life essence, and in animism, consciousness is all to do with this kind of, animism, this kind of old idea that lots of human societies had, that there's some kind of animating force to life, which is synonymous with consciousness. So it's it harkens back to those kinds of insights. But yeah, so this kind of pan-biological picture is my story that I'm telling about why I think consciousness exists and how it comes into existence. And there's a whole range of other stories you can take if you prefer. There's the kind of all the way from thinking consciousness is fundamental in some sense, perhaps only consciousness exists, all the way to the kind of mainstream scientific idea that it's something special about hugely interconnected human brains, and that someday some kind of as yet undiscovered property of human brains gives rise to it. But philosophers famously think that that's a dead-end project. You can never say anything about a brain because it's just a lump of meat. You can never say something about a brain in isolation that will allow you to get kind of consciousness from it, and I agree. In the future, I'll talk about how this maps into neuroscience, because the brain still is the existence of consciousness is a property of the environment coupled with the living system, but the contents are all to do with the kind of patterns going on within the organism, although they are, as I said before, they align with the world around. But so it makes sense that the brain is kind of the crucial node in this network of us being coupled with our environment that mediates this consciousness. But you can't say it's fundamentally located in the brain. It's not located anywhere, like running. Running is not located in the legs. You need to factor in the fact that the floor and the gravity and all of those things come together to make running possible. And the same kind of picture is what I think is how we need to understand consciousness. So I hope that was interesting. Send me any questions. I'm doing a Patreon AMA soon. If you want any more specific details, but I'll be talking about this a lot more. So stay tuned.